Good evening. We're going to get, hello, thank you. Good evening. All right, no, I'm going to do it one more time. Good evening. All right, now we can get started. Okay. Well, welcome once again to the Race in the United States ULEC here at the New School. We're really privileged tonight, and thank you all for those of you who are coming on a different night. It's not our usual night, but it was very important to us that we have this particular lecture, and Lawrence Weschler, our esteemed lecturer, I'll tell the truth about him later, but right now I'll call him esteemed, is that he actually teaches on Monday nights, so he wasn't going to be able to come unless we move the night. So thank you for indulging us, for those of you taking the class for credit, and hope that for those of you coming to this lecture, because it's Lawrence Weschler and the topic, that you also might check out some of our other lectures that are coming up, which are Monday nights at 6, and they're also live streamed. But the reason this was important, and I'll give a quick introduction of Ren in a minute, and only very quick. Those of us who've known him for a long time call him Ren, so don't get confused, is that, you know, there's a fundamental conversation I think we are sort of having and not having as a country about what it means to witness, and who can witness and how they can witness what's happening in race in the United States. And I want to quote James Baldwin, both because he's one of my favorite authors. He's also one of Ren's, and Ren and I have actually done some work and some panels on the work of James Baldwin. So it seems appropriate to quote him when he says, "All art is a kind of a confession. All artists, if they are to survive, are forced at last to tell the whole story." And there is a whole story about race in the United States that continues to need to be told and historically has never fully been told. And some of the things that we're going to hear in this lecture really is about some of that witnessing by artists. And that, especially as a university that has so much creative thought leadership, I think it was important to also consider the role of art in the context of race in the United States. But I also wanted to reflect on one other thing that James Baldwin was also so important to in the history of the United States, and as a writer I think is very similar to what Lawrence Weschler actually has represented to us in this country and in this world, which is that witness. And James Baldwin says, "Generations do not cease to be born, and we are responsible to them because we are the only witnesses they have." And of course, it's also the role of a writer to be an artist that is a witness. So Lawrence Weschler is here in part because he's always been that witness. He's also been an activist in his own right, and so I will say a few embarrassing things about him because I've had the great good fortune to know him for many years, which is that in addition to being the writer that you all may know and came to see, which just to say, I'm not even going to read his whole bio because he's done too dang much. But as a staff writer for The New Yorker from 1981 to 2002, where his work shuttled between political tragedies and cultural comedies, and I would argue actually really connected the relationship between the political and the cultural, especially as it's expressed through art. And he's done a number of books, some of A Passion of Poland. He's written about the Solidarity movement in Poland, A Miracle and a Universe, Settling Accounts with Torturers, where he talks about the incredible importance of reconciliation to the invigoration of democracy in places like Brazil and South Africa. And more pieces than I can name, and accolades and awards rightly received, but he's also been an activist in his own right. And one of the ways I know Ren is that he actually was engaged in third-party politics with my mother, and they were the platform committee of the Citizens Party. There are a whole lot of stories that can be told there. I was told by Ren I couldn't tell them because then there would be no Q&A time in the class, and then you all would come after me. So I will stop there, but invite anyone who wants to hear the truth about Lawrence Weschler that has not yet been published. I will be happy to share, but I give you Lawrence Weschler.
And I can give you the truth about Maya at some point. Anyway, thank you all for coming. So I'm trying to interleaf various thoughts in the talk today. And I thought I'd begin with, let's see if this didn't work. Yeah. Some of you may remember that there was a controversy at the Whitney Museum during their biennial. Here are two paintings that were quite notable at the Whitney. The one on the left is, of course, a evocation of what happened to Philando Castile, the terrible shooting that was being recorded immediately afterwards by his girlfriend on her iPhone. The one on the right evokes Emmett Till, who was a 14-year-old boy who was killed in Money, Mississippi, back in 1954. The one on the left is by a white artist. The one on the right is by a black artist. And there was a huge protest at a certain point, very early on when it began. A woman named Hannah Black led a coalition of artists, she had a petition which more or less demanded that the painting not just be removed from the show, but that furthermore be destroyed altogether so that it can never be allowed to enter into any market or museum. We're talking about, well, anyway, she says, although the artist's intention may be to present white shame, this shame is not correctly represented as a painting of a dead black boy by a white artist. Oh, wait a second, that makes me realize, of course, that's the one by the white artist, and that's the one by the black artist. And my question for you is, does that change anything? How you received it just now? But anyway, she was saying, she made a point, and this, by the way, was signed by many, many artists, that this shame is not correctly represented by a painting of a dead black boy by a white artist. Those non-black artists who sincerely wish to highlight the shameful nature of white violence should first of all stop treating black pain as their raw material. The subject matter is not theirs. White free speech and white creative freedom have been founded on the constraint of others and are not natural rights. This painting must go. She went on from there. This painting depicts the dead body of a 14-year-old Emmett Till in the open casket that his mother chose, saying, "Let the people see what I've seen." Emmett Till, that is, the boy in question. Let's look at that picture more carefully. By the way, I should say that this is a painting by Dana Schutz. The other one was by Henry Taylor. But this painting is singularly ill-represented by a photograph. It's actually built up with all kinds of layers and gashes and so forth. Setting aside the quality of the painting, it is based on this horrendous photograph of what happened in 1955 to Emmett Till. Emmett Till had been a 14-year-old boy from Chicago, went down to see his grandparents in Money, Mississippi, either did or did not whistle at a white woman. 50 years later, just recently, the white woman admitted that, in fact, he didn't even do that. In any case, he was beaten so badly and horrifically, his face was literally twice as large as it should have been, like a broken watermelon. And his mother, quite unusually and quite specifically, demanded that his coffin be open so everybody could see. Black, however, said that she didn't mean that anybody could take advantage of it, certainly not white people. She wrote that even the disfigured corpse of a child was not sufficient to move the white gaze from its habitual cold calculation is evident daily and in a myriad of ways, not least the fact that this painting exists at all. In brief, the painting should not be acceptable to anyone who cares or pretends to care about black people. Black people, because it is not acceptable for a white person to transmute black suffering into profit and fun. So the practice has been normalized for a long time, and so forth. It's worth mentioning just to begin with that, in fact, the people who, when Emmett Till's mother said, I want all the people to see, she meant all the people of the United States. And not only that, but it had a huge effect. If you think about the year 1955, within a few years you have, Little Rock, you have the Montgomery bus boycott. These things are all very much responsible for the civil rights movement. And the horror of this particular picture, photograph, and her bravery in allowing that to be seen was of the moment. That, by the way, is the woman who wrote the petition, Hannah Black, who parenthetically was half English. And then there were people standing in front of it at the museum. And this, in turn, is Dana Schutz, who said, one of the things that she said is, first of all, I was never going to sell it. It was never going to be for sale. It was never going to enter the market. And secondly, she was doing it in response precisely to the whole number of people, such as Castile and everybody else who were being killed. And she had recently become a mother, and she was identifying with all the mothers. And in some ways, I think that painting is a painting of the gesture of the mother of Emmett Till, to demand that everything be seen. In any case, leaving all that aside and bracketing it for a while, and it has become a considerable controversy as to who has the right, let alone the duty, to portray different sorts of pain in art, and who isn't allowed to do so, or should not be allowed to do so. I wanted to kind of open a trapdoor and fall back. Let's see, it's almost 50 years to the work of Ed Keane Holtz, and that's what I want to turn to now. Ed Keane Holtz was born in Washington State, rural Washington State. He comes to Los Angeles at around age 30 in 1956, 57. He's the kind of guy who can just do anything. He can do, he fixed cars, do plumbing. He drove around for a long time when he wasn't being an artist with a truck that just said expert, and he made his living doing that sort of thing. He was also a country boy. He was very proud of his guns. He was, he had a kind of disdain for the wussiness of people in the city. And he helped to found one of the great galleries in the history of art in the last half of the 20th century in America, the Ferris Gallery in Los Angeles, which is where all sorts of people, Robert Irwin, Billy L. Bankston, Diebenkorn, all kinds of people have shows there early on, and he was one of the two founders of that gallery. In the meantime, he was also working. He began by doing these kind of strange collages out of kind of claptrap. This was his version of Leda and the Swan, for those of you who know that story. But he also, from early on, he began making these three-dimensional objects, and some of them dealt with race. That's a 1958 piece on the left, which was Little Rock Cha-Cha-Cha, about integration. The one on the right is evocative of the Holocaust, all those dolls at the bottom. He often worked with dolls. He made crazy stroller things. And then he began making these tableaus. And the first of his tableaus went from the sacred to the profane. The first one was a version of the kind of nativity scenes that his mother used to do back in rural Washington, although in this case, the Mother Mary is represented by a heating grill, and that's Joseph on a hobby horse and so forth. He then went, at the same time, he started with that one, but then he made one of a brothel called Roxy's. All of the different characters you can see, for example, over there's a whore on a treadle machine, and they're all. And if you lifted the waistline of this one here, she had a clock in her belly. So he's doing all kinds of surrealist, very visceral kinds of art, at the same time with incredible attention to detail. There were people who recognized the brothel in Nevada where this used to be for people coming back from the Korean War. He then did a very famous piece called Backseat Dodge, where he took a Dodge car, sawed it in half, and then portrayed the kind of moral dodging that was going on inside the back seat. you would open the back seat, you would kind of be shocked at what you were seeing, and then you would notice that the windows on the far side were mirrors reflecting your hypocrisy and so forth back at you. That one almost got the LA Museum shut down when it was the first modern art show at the new facility, and the supervisors, all trying to one-up each other, demanded to be shut down, leading to a picture of the supervisors inside the car and the citizens saying, it's awful, close the door. He did pieces about abortion. He made a 2/3 size version of his favorite bar, Barney's Beanery, and you might notice that all the people in the bar are kind of just wasting time. Their faces are clocks all stuck at the same time. The only one who's not is Barney himself. It was Barney's Beanery, and that's his self-portrait up there in the other side. You could walk inside. Again, notice just the incredible plotting of material reality. He just has everything that actually is at a bar like that. The one you might have seen here in New York is his piece called The Weight, which is a grandmother who's fashioned out of cow bones and has all of her memories necklaced around her in jugs. And there's a live parakeet in the corner. Sometimes when you're at the Whitney, you hear a parakeet off in the corner, and that's his. He took on mental illness in a piece that was, you weren't able to walk through this room. You came up to the window and you looked inside and you saw that. I mean, these pieces are he's always using plaster casts of actual people to make them. In this case, had a friend who was dying of cancer who volunteered to be plaster cast twice. There's two goldfish bowls. The one in the bottom is empty. The one on the top has a goldfish moving around. He did some crazy conceptual pieces. He had one piece where he signed the entire world as the largest found object ever and laid claim to it. Before, in 1970, long before Maya Lin's Vietnam War Memorial, at a time when very little memorializing was taking place, he proposed that one take a piece of marshland in Idaho and set up a factory. By the time he was finished proposing the piece, the proposal was that he would buy 58,000 sets of Army surplus pants and clothes and shirts. He would then have a factory set up of people, volunteers, to tie up the arms of the pants and the legs of the legs of the pants, the arms of the shirts, tie them together and fill them with slurried mud, and then just throw all of those slurried mud bodies into the marshland, because he just wanted to see how long it would take to create that much death. And then he was going to invite people to come and just claim their own, because that was the number of Americans who had died in the war. In any case, in the later 60s, or all through the 60s, he was not unaware. He wasn't confronting directly the civil rights movement and so forth, but he certainly was aware of it and was very much shaken by the assassination of Martin Luther King. So strange to see that picture of King in the middle after having seen the Emmett Till picture and realize that that's just a bit over 10 years separating those two pictures. In any case, he decided that he wanted to do a major tableau about race relations in America. And it, in fact, took him 2 years to do it. He lived on top of a hill near Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles. And it was 58 steps up. He had to carry all the parts he was going to do, which included 5 cars and all kinds. It was a crazy project. I'll just show you a beginning of a documentary about how he's doing it. And this actually, you'll be able to see. Gradually putting together the different people. Well, actually, just precisely because we had to go quickly, he does exactly that. He dresses them and so forth. After 2 years, he has a piece that he has created that is so harrowing that it cannot be shown. He brings it down from the hill to try and show it in Los Angeles. It cannot be shown in LA. It's agreed that it will be shown in New York. It gets to New York. It cannot be shown in New York. It's just too horrible. It goes to London. It cannot be shown in London. Finally, it shows up in 1972 at Documenta, which is in Kassel, Germany. They built a whole big plastic tent to have it be inside that tent. And it is indeed, it is shown there. It is bought out of that show by a Japanese museum. It is transported across the Trans-Siberian Railroad, where much of it is stolen and broken up. And when it gets to Japan, they do the classic Japanese thing in such cases, which is the curators agree to put it in storage for as many years until everybody involved is dead. And in fact, it disappeared. And for a long time, there were only a few thousand people who'd seen it, and it existed as a rumor. People talked about it. A few years ago, when the Getty took up, the LA County Museum started the Pacific Standard Time show, which was, I guess, 5 years ago now. They got what was left of it out of the museum, and they refurbished it and showed it for the first time in the United States. It was then supposed to tour the United States and Europe, and then eventually settle. It looked like it was going to end up at the Museum of Modern Art. There was some talk of that, and it was going to be at PS1. However, in the middle of its being transported around, they got a competing bid from the Prada Museum in Milan, which is why what I would argue is one of the most significant works of art on race in the history of the United States, has been seen in the United States for about 6 weeks altogether in Los Angeles, or 8 weeks, whatever it was, and may never be seen again. So, as I say, it's a horrendous thing to experience. You go, you enter it in LA. It was also shown at the Louisiana Museum in Denmark, and it has been at the Prada in Milan. And it's in a very dark, much bigger than this, maybe twice as large as this room, dark room. And you enter, and it's kind of soft. It's kind of very, very fine dirt. It muffles your sound as you walk in. And up in the distance, you see something's going on. You see a bunch of cars with their lights. There's a truck off to the side, and then there's 4 cars aiming their headlights at something in the middle, which you can't yet see because they're blocking what's going on. And I did a video, just a hand video. Let's see, give you a sense of what it's like. And I'll move it along a little bit, so it's because. But you're. Let's see. I want to turn off the sound actually. Turn off the sound. So basically, you can see. Let me just stop it here. That something's going on. You can't quite figure out what's going on. And up ahead, as you were coming, by the way, there's this kind of very, very thin blues radio station that you can't quite figure out where the music's coming from. But you kind of see this is something there, and then you move along, and you bump, as you're moving along, you almost bump into this guy behind you. And he's holding a gun in front of the open door of the pickup truck where the music is coming out of. He is standing with a gun, with a beer belly. He has a Halloween mask on. And you suddenly realize almost everybody in the piece has a Halloween mask on. He's holding a gun. We'll keep going here. And if you look inside the car, it's a little bit dark here, but there's a woman in there. It's in this light, you can't see, but she's a woman, and she's kind of leaning over and she's retching. And then you turn around and you walk past him. There she is inside the car. And you turn around, and again, these people you still can't quite see what's going on. because you're walking around, you are brought into kind of being like as if you yourself are pulling on the rope too, because you're right behind this guy who's pulling. Again, look at the detail, the crumpledness of the shirt, of the jacket, the hair on the back of the neck. And now you're beginning to see what's going on. This guy on the ground is red-eagled. And these guys are on top of him, and they're castrating him. This is the kind of thing that used to happen all the time. Look at the details again. Everything gets shellacked with varnish, and just looks like the sweat of this ghoul. The body, by the way, it's just legs, arms, and a head. The body is made out of an automotive tub, the kind of thing you would see at a garage, you know, and that they put the oil in. So there's black liquid, and there's 6 children's blocks with letters on them. The letters are N-I-G-G-E-R, but they're floating around, and so they very seldom are actually in that configuration. And you continue to walk around. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. You continue to walk around, and then finally you really can see for the first time the head of the guy who's screaming. Puppet. I want to have this go. I have to go back one, yeah. Does that. But the thing is, as you're leaving, and by the way, you're just walking around and you have this moment of horror at what you're seeing, and there's almost like, you know, I didn't know. How could I possibly have known? How could we have known? And then you notice that all around are footsteps. It's almost like a tornado of footsteps because everybody else who's been there has walked around too. And this is the great secret history of America. And as you are leaving and you turn around to leave, you start to walk out between the cars, and you notice that one of the guys has brought his son, his 10-year-old son. There's a technical term for what the son is being instructed in. This is called Lynchcraft, how to do it. And you eventually leave, but it's, and you get outside, and it's completely upsetting. And you notice about 2 hours later that the sand, the dirt is on your shoes, and you try to get it off. And I don't know what he did. It's almost like there's some oiliness on the dirt or something. It's very, very hard to get the dirt off your shoes. And it's typical of the kind of thing that Keane Holtz would do when he took on a subject. And it's very, very hard to get the images out of your head. One of the things that what people were critical about at first was the sense that how do you make a tableau out of this? But it's worth remembering that in the days of lynching, and keep in mind the days of lynching are after the Civil War, because slaves would never have been lynched because they were property. So, but it's in fact, it really begins after the first people are born who were born after 1865 have reached maturity. So in 1886, when you have 21-year-olds, you begin to have uppity blacks in there, and they start being lynched as a campaign to beat down any kind of assertion of subjectivity. But one of the things that's quite striking about those is that they themselves were often set up as tableaus. This is not art. This is actual cases of how people were found. Also, to complicate things, and it's very strange, in 1968, the same year that he started doing this piece, there was a black artist in San Francisco who also did a piece called Castration. I would guess in response to exactly the same things that the killing of Malcolm X, the killing of Martin Luther King, and so forth. And for that matter, as one moves forward in art, you can right now go see the Kara Walker show, amazing artist in Chelsea, and you will notice that she herself, in one of her images, look at that again. It's a big wall piece. It's much bigger than that screen. And if you look at it carefully, you'll see that in the middle of it, she has flipped it. It has a black rebellion in which a white man is being killed, only in his case, disemboweled, with direct reference to the Keane Holtz piece. Anyway, coming back to the critique about whether or not it's quite okay for white people to do this. It seems to me that this comes out of there's a whole kind of academic critical theory stuff, and most of this is coming out of art schools or out of universities or people who've been to universities and so forth, who, and you get phrases like privilege and complicate and intersectionality and appropriation and post-colonial and gendered and cisgendered and gays and all those words that you're all familiar with from your classes, all of which were vivid and important kinds of words at one time. I tend to think that they have been debased and are becoming more and more cliched, and instead of provoking thought, they're preventing thought, or they tend often to default and end discussion rather than start discussion, as in the example of Hannah Black, who says that while what the points she was making were interesting and perhaps important, the idea that what you do with them is that the next step is to destroy the work seemed to me to be a step too far, at least. Also, it seems to me that what you're dealing with here is something that my own professor, Donald Nickel, a great lay Catholic theologian, once described. Well, what he did, he described the early Christian church. And he spoke about heresies. When you study Augustine and people like that, there's endless numbers of heresies that are going on. And he said that most people nowadays have the wrong idea about heresies. Heresies are not wrong because they are false. Rather, they are taking up a long neglected aspect of the truth and idolatrizing it as the whole truth. So a heresy has a problem with proportion rather than with verity. And it insists on being the whole thing. So in that sense, you can talk about a feminist heresy, a black heresy, any number of kinds of heresies, which are trying to be corrective, but end up, the danger is that they end up going overboard. And in this context, I'm reminded of a completely different way of thinking about this, which indeed is our friend James Baldwin. I should say, by the way, that increasingly, and you see it more and more in the last few years, if you look at that generation of writers in the United States, and I'm talking about John Updike, Norman Mailer, William Styron, we can put Philip Roth off to the side to some extent, but that generation, the most salient, the most important, the most urgent of those writers is turning out to have been Norman Mailer. It's turning out to be James Baldwin. Aside from the fact that he's a great stylist and writer, he's also such an important moral force, and you got a little bit of it from what Maya was reading. But one of the things that I've always found amazing about him is his use of the word we. He has this wandering we in his rhetoric, and it comes out of the fact that he fled America in 1948. He said he had to leave or he would have killed somebody. nobody in particular, just that the rage of the racism he was facing was going to end up with him killing somebody. And he goes to Paris. And at first he is hanging out with the Algerians and the Africans in Paris and trying to make common identity with them. But in Paris, he discovers something very interesting. He discovers that what he is an American. And he eventually returns. And when he says we, half the time he's saying we Americans, half the time he's saying we blacks. He's often saying the way we treat black people. I mean, it's very shifty and fascinating the way the we works. I'll just read you an extended passage which might present another way of looking at who gets and who should talk about things. In a book of his called, an essay called Words of a Native Son. The story that I hope to live long enough to tell, to get it out somehow, whole and entire, has to do with the terrible, terrible damage we are doing to our children. Because what is happening on the streets of Harlem to black boys and girls is also happening on all American streets to everybody. It's a terrible delusion to think that any part of this republic can be safe as long as 20 million members of it are as menaced as they are. The reality I am trying to get to is the humanity of this submerged population is equal to the humanity of anyone else, equal to yours, equal to that of your child. I know when I walk into a Harlem funeral parlor and see a dead boy lying there, I know, no matter what the social scientists say or the liberals say, that it is extremely unlikely that he would be in his grave so soon if he were not black. That is a terrible thing to have to say. But if it is so, then people who are responsible for this are in a terrible condition. Please take note. I'm not interested in anybody's guilt. Guilt is a luxury that we can no longer afford. I know you didn't do it and I didn't do it either, but I am responsible for it because I am a man and a citizen of this country, and you are responsible for it too for the very same reason. We must make the great effort to realize that there is no such thing as a Negro problem, but simply a menaced boy. If we could do this, if we could save this country, we could save the world. Anyway, that dead boy is my subject and my responsibility, and yours. And unlike Hannah Black, I think the yours there is being addressed to everybody in this room. And the demand is for a kind of witness from everybody. Upstairs, when you're at the museum during the Whitney, there was a painting upstairs. They had a little show of paintings of the 80s. And there was this remarkable painting by Eric Fischel from 1980-81 at a time when there were a lot of Haitian boat people arriving in Miami, many of them drowning off the coast. The painting is called A Visit to the Islands, A Visit from the Islands. A visit to, a visit from the islands. Is Hannah Black and people who are taking that sort of position saying that it's good for him to have done the left side of the painting, but he shouldn't have done the right side of the painting? Is that what we're saying at this point? And that's not even to mention the elephant in the room in terms of this whole controversy. Because, excuse me, don't these petitioners and their fellow critique theory people have something more important to worry about at this of all times? While they gnash and rage and train their fire on fellow cultural workers, real racists and white supremacists are busy cementing their hold on the highest reaches of our government. I'm reminded of an amazing passage, and this gives you some idea how long this has been going on, from back in the early 80s by a wonderful critical theorist, a wonderful theorist poet named Elliot Weinberger. And he said he was talking to a group of academic poets in 1980. And he begins by saying that he wants to give a talk about politics. I take politics, the word politics, in a very narrow sense, that is how governments are run. And I think the word government to mean the organized infliction or alleviation of suffering among one's own people or among other people, which, by the way, is a great definition of government if you think about it. He goes on, one of the things that happened after the Vietnam War was that in the United States anyway, on the intellectual left, politics metamorphosed into something entirely different. identity politics and its nerd brother theory, who thought he was a Marxist but never allowed any actual governments to interrupt his train of thought. The right, however, stuck to politics in the narrow sense. This is at a moment when Reagan has just been elected. In the narrow sense, and grew powerful in the absence of any genuine political opposition or even criticism. For the left had its mind elsewhere. It was preoccupied with finding examples of sexism, classism, racism, colonialism, homophobia, usually among its own members or the long dead, while ignoring the genuine and active racist, sexist, homophobes of the right, and it tended to express itself in an incomprehensible academic jargon or in tangentially referential academic poetry under the delusion that such language was some form of resistance to the prevailing power structure. Power, of course, only being imagined in the abstract. Never mind that truly political revolutionary works, Tom Paine or the Communist Manifesto or Brecht or Hikmet or 1,000 others, are always written in simple, direct speech. Meanwhile, Ronald Reagan was completely dismantling the Great Society and so forth and so on. Going back to Clive Carstad and suggesting a different way of thinking about this, I wanted to just give you a sense of the book I'm going to write, which is really begins with the fact that this is not a work, that this is not a tableau about black people. This is a tableau about white people. The question to ask of this tableau is, what are those guys of all people, what are they doing to that guy? What is that all about? And it in turn reminds me of a gorgeous passage also from Norman Mailer. Excuse me, I keep saying Norman Mailer, from James Baldwin. This is from his long essay, Nothing Personal. It is, of course, in the very nature of a myth that those who are its victims and at the same time its perpetrators should, by virtue of these two facts, be rendered unable to examine the myth or even to suspect, much less recognize, that it is a myth which controls and blasts their lives. One sees this, it seems to me, in great and grim relief in the situation of the poor white in the Deep South. The poor white was enslaved almost from the instant he arrived on these shores, and he is still enslaved by a brutal and cynical oligarchy. The utility of the poor white was to make slavery both profitable and safe, and therefore the germ of white supremacy, which he brought with him from Europe, was made hideously to flourish in the American era. 2 world wars and a worldwide depression have failed to reveal to this poor man that he has far more in common with the ex-slaves whom he fears than he has with the masters who oppress them both for profit. It is no accident that ancient Scottish ballads and Elizabethan chants are still heard in those dark hills. Talk about a people being locked in the past. To be locked in the past means, in effect, that one has no past, since one can never assess it or use it, and if one cannot use the past, one cannot function in the present, and so can never be free. I take this to be, as I say, the American situation in relief, the root of our unadmitted sorrow, and the very key to our crisis. I mentioned, and if I had much more time, I talked about the way that over and over again in American history, class gets trumped by race, and especially when you are beginning to have class consciousness emerge, when you're beginning to have poor people begin to realize that they have more in common than against, race gets used often by people on top, often by billionaires with orange hair and their cohort, and it's almost always the way it's used is a sexualized anxiety, which is usually the flip side of what actually happened. I mean, when you look at blacks in America, you will notice that most of them are not, black, African black. They have tinctures, all sorts of, there's a whole literature on the different kinds of coloring, and that does not happen because, as the poor white or people are urged to fear the black man rapes the white women. This happens because thousands and thousands and thousands of times in slavery times and all through years, it was white men raping black women, black slaves. And I mean, that's the overwhelming part of it. And yet that's used to terrify the whites, and then it's used to provoke violence. And the book I'm going to be doing eventually has to do with the fact that there's Ed Keane Holtz putting those cars together. Every single one of those cars has a rear view mirror. And I want to look at the 8 rear view mirrors of the cars facing forward and stop and look at 8 moments of history that kind of define the kind of thing that happened. I'm just going to give you a few very, very quick examples. I have a few minutes. For example, if you look at the first rear view mirror, you come upon Nathaniel Bacon. Any of you know about Bacon's Rebellion? Have you heard of Bacon's Rebellion? An incredibly interesting thing, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, by the way, has been writing about this a lot. It's very, very interesting. A remarkable thing is that in the early days of Jamestown, in the 1600s, 1620 is when Jamestown gets founded, and you begin to have a tobacco plantation and so forth. For the first 60, 70 years, there are no slaves. There are indentured servants. There are lots of white indentured servants, and there are many black indentured servants who are coming from the Caribbean. And there doesn't seem to have been in the literature a racial problem. They got along fine with each other. They all had the same problem, that they had taken on debt to come, and then their debt kept on having interest, and they weren't able to liberate themselves from it. But in any case, they eventually gradually get a class consciousness, and in 1680, there was a rebellion of these indentured servants. It's not a pretty picture, actually, as the real history never is pretty. In this case, what's happening is all the good land on the coast has already been had, so poor whites are pushed further and further toward the west. They run up against Indians, Native Americans. There start being wars and so forth. The poor whites demand that the rich whites on the coast defend them better. The rich whites refuse to do that. They have reasons. They have treaties with the Indians and so forth. So suddenly there's an uprising. A guy named Nathaniel Bacon leads white and black indentured servants to come back on Jamestown. They burn down Jamestown, and there's a whole paper trail of this. The aristocracy, the oligarchy, the rich whites on the coast, who are, by the way, the grandfathers of all of our founding fathers, the rich whites get together and say, you know what? We can't have indentured servants anymore. We need slaves. Not only that, but we can't get slaves from the Caribbean because they're too politicized already. We have to get them from Africa, and we have to bring them together and make sure that they don't speak each other's languages in our place and so forth. And this is all in writing, the major advantage of this is that we'll be able to convince the white indentured servants that they have more in common with us than they do with the pathetic blacks on the other side, and we can play them off against each other. This is all thought out. If you go to another rearview mirror, you're looking at the events that lead up to the American Revolution. There's a book that's recently been published, which I urge you to look at, called The CounterRevolution of 1776. And it turns out, this is incredibly interesting, that what happens is that in 1770, you have this flourishing trade in the South in slaves. And in 1770, there's a case of an American who goes back to London with his slave. The slave escapes, and the slave is captured, but the slave says, I escaped and I shouldn't have to be given back to this guy. And it goes all the way to the British Supreme Court, as it were, and Lord Mansfield decides that no, he doesn't have to be given back. That slavery is so hideous that there's no property right in England. It's banned in England, and it doesn't have to be given back. Those of you who are fans of the American Revolution know that the generation that's going to lead up to it starts committees of correspondence where they're writing all kinds of letters to each other about how horrible the tyranny from England is. This is what they're writing about. It's this case that the committees of correspondence start. And then, as it goes further on, you have all these speeches, and I give you Patrick Henry, for example. All these speeches that are basically, let me see if I can find quickly. Yeah, listen to this. Give me liberty or give me death. This is a Virginia Brahmin, Patrick Henry, but the speeches immediately before that is, he wants to know, it is now too late to retire from the contest, he says. There is no retreat but in submission and slavery. Our chains are being forged. Their clanking can be heard on the plains of Boston. In other words, the image that they all have of what they're going to fight for is freedom, is liberty. They don't want to be slaves. They're constantly saying they don't want to be slaves. The fact, and what they want liberty is the liberty to own slaves. And in that sense, this book, his name is George Hearn, I believe. I'll get you his name in a second. But anyway, the CounterRevolution suggests an entirely different way of looking at the American Revolution. There are some people who don't go along with this, although it's worth noting that, for example, in May 1775, at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, John Hancock, remember John Hancock, the big signature, the biggest slaveholder in Boston, alongside his Southern colleagues, denounced London's alleged attempts to, quote, convert colonists from freemen into slaves. This goes on and on. On the other hand, Abigail, John Adams' wife, writes her husband, it has always appeared a most iniquitous scheme to fight ourselves for what we are daily robbing and plundering from those who have as good a right to freedom as we have. But in any case, the war is fought to be independent of a tyranny that would take away the right, at least on the southern half, to have slaves. I'll just do one or two more of these things, just to give you a sense. A third rearview mirror is what happens after the war, before you get to the Constitution. Now, it's worth remembering that the war is fought not by the bankers and the industrialists and so forth of the North, or the plantation owners of the South. It's fought by poor people, largely poor farmers. And they are paid in continental scrip, in other words, IOUs from a government that doesn't yet exist. And when they come back, having fought for 8 years, they are told that their farms are about to be foreclosed upon them because they haven't been paying their rent to the landowners in Boston, for example. And the farmers say, well, here's the continental scrip. And they say, no, we're not going to accept that. You have to give us real gold or real coin. And at that point, there's a rebellion. And the militia of Massachusetts is sent out to put down the rebellion, but the militia is made up of farmers and joins the rebellion. And at that point, the Boston aristocracy and the Southern slave owners, who are equally afraid of their slaves, get together and say, we have to have a national army. We have to have this thing about all 13 colonies is not working. The Confederation is not working. And that is the reason you have meetings of the Continental Congress, of the Constitutional Convention, 10 years after the Revolution in 1788, described by the historian Michael Goldfield as a self-selected elite meets in secret sessions to draft a constitution. Most delegates were merchants, lawyers, landowners, and Southern planters. The many popular Democratic representatives of the common people had been clearly excluded. The elites had watched with anguish as state legislatures had passed laws to protect debtors in disregard to their creditors. This was horrifying when legislatures at the state level were doing this, and they had to figure out some way around that. Few of these elites had sympathy for the more radical notions of the revolution, and fewer still gave opposition to the plantation slavery high priority. By the time of the convention, power had shifted from those who wanted to push for greater democratic control of the new polity toward those who wished to secure the property rights of the new aristocracy of wealth. Again, looking back at that picture, at Five Car Stud, the name of Keane Holtz's piece, that is about what's going on with those white people. What is happening? Why are they? What is going on? At the Constitution, you have the founding fathers putting together a document which has an incredible. I'm just going to talk about two of them. One of them is extremely important to understand. The Second Amendment does not give individuals the right to bear arms. It says a well-regulated militia being necessary for whatever people shall have arms. The people's right to have arms will not be abridged. And the point there is the militia is, this is especially particularly put forward by southern states where there are a majority of black citizens, black slaves in those states, and they are terrified of them. In the Caribbean, on the islands, there are regular slave uprisings. There are regular slave uprisings in America too, and they need to have a militia. And this is a piece of the Constitution that says they're going to have a right to have a militia. This is for slavery. That is what the Second Amendment is about. You similarly have the 3/5 clause. When I was going to school, you know that in the Constitution, in our founding document, there is a passage that says that black people will be considered 3/5 of a person. When I was in high school, and even until relatively recently, I used to think, that's disgusting. They're not 3/5 of a person, they're a whole person. Wrong answer. That's not what that is about. What that is about is that a slave owner who has 100 slaves wanted to insist that his vote would count for 101 votes, even though he was the only one voting. And the compromise that was made was, no, it'll count for 60 votes. It'll be 3/5. Because of that, and because of the invention of the Senate, which was also designed for the same purpose, to make sure that less populous states would have more power, and in those days, the less populous states were in the South. The Constitution, which, by the way, is the Constitution that the originalists, Scalia and so forth, keep on wanting to go back to, and you're not allowed to do anything that the founding fathers didn't intend. But because of those kinds of things, the fact is that although we had, the South had 38% of the population for the first 80 years, roughly. That's including the slaves. Because of that fact, 5 of the first 7 presidents of the Republic, for 32 of the first 36 years, for 40 of the first 48, for 50 of the first 64, were slaveholders. The Speaker of the House for 28 out of the first 35 was a slaveholder. It was an anomaly of the President pro tem of the Senate was not. A majority of cabinet members and Supreme Court justices were slaveholders. 3 of the first 5 chiefs of justices for 74 of the Supreme Court's first 84 years were slaveholders, despite the fact that only 38% came from slaveholding places. This is baked deep, deep, deep into the American reality. And that is what Five-Car Stud, what Keane Holtz's piece is about. I'm just going to give you one more example, and then we're going to wrap up pretty quickly. I'll jump ahead to the election of 1876, which is, again, pertinent in terms of our more recent history. You'll remember 1865, Lincoln is killed, but you do have Reconstruction. Reconstruction consists of the blacks of the South are liberated, they are given land and so forth and so on, they're allowed to vote. You have a period of incipient democracy going on in the South. Southerners hate it, but it actually, and if you're my age, you were taught that it was a complete disaster as it was happening, but in fact, it was working relatively well. In 1876, you have a very, very close election. The person who won the election, Samuel Tilden, governor of New York, had, I think he needed 171 votes, electoral votes. He had 170. Rutherford B. Hayes, oddly enough, the Republican, a very corrupt Republican official, makes a backroom deal with the Southern delegates and says, if you throw your vote to me, and said, even though I lost the popular vote, if you throw your vote to me, I will take the army, the federal army, out of the South. It's 1876, and that's called the Dirty Deal, and it happens. And there's a remarkable past. The great historian of this is W.E.B. Du Bois, who, the great founder of the NAACP, he wrote all incredible history books and so forth. But one of the things he points out is we all know that the army leaves the South, and that white labor in the North doesn't support black slaves in the South. But the question is, where does the army go? And a clue is, what are all those armories doing in American cities? The Park Avenue Armory, the Armory in St. Louis, all the armories. The army is pulled out of the South and goes north to be able to fight labor. The very next year, 1877, strikes break out all over America. White workers, it's the railroad strikes. There will be another 20, 30 years of strikes in which time and again the army is brought to put down labor. Du Bois writes, thus labor went into the Great War of 1877 against Northern capital, unsupported by the black man, and the black man went his way in the South to strengthen and consolidate his power, unsupported by Northern labor. Suppose for a moment that Northern labor had stopped the bargain of 1876 and maintained the power of labor vote in the South. And suppose that the Negro, with new and dawning consciousness of the demands of labor as differentiated from the demands of capitalists, had used his vote more specifically for the benefit of white labor, South and North. What kind of country could we have had? That is the question that is being asked in a five-car stud in the Keane Holtz piece. In closing, I just want to bring out one other person. I would just say that Miss Black and her fellow petitioners and people who support them, and I do enjoy conversations and so forth, they have raised some important points in their letter, but those points should be at most seen precisely as invitations to further consideration and engagement, not the foreclosure of all possible discourse. How should the heroine be representative, and by what right indeed? Aimé Césaire, the great Francophone poet, politician, and essayist out of Martinique in the Caribbean, and one of the founders of the Negritude movement of the mid-20th century, once wrote, most of all beware, even in thought, of assuming the sterile attitude of the spectator. For life is not a spectacle, a sea of grief is not a proscenium, a man who wails is not a dancing bear. It seems to me that one should, approaching all of these topics, be worthy of James Baldwin and Césaire, for that matter, the thousands, the millions of people, our fellow countrymen who have suffered to bring us to where we are today. Thank you. Apparently we're going to have, I'm going to sit, do I sit here now? And
Yeah, and we're going to, sorry, I was trying to fix the lights so we could actually see you. So this is your opportunity to be in the discussion with questions or comments.
By the way, I can stand here as long as you want, because I'm not embarrassed by these moments of silence. Don't get to leave until you ask some questions.
Appropriation as a kind of a heresy that challenges us to think about what we're really seeing when we see white artists witnessing on the horrors of race in the United States. So is there ever art that you've seen that you think has crossed that line where you would say would be appropriate? Because it would lift up that point you just read so poignantly by Aimé Césaire, right, where it becomes the dancing bear.
No, I mean, I think that's really a question you have to ask. I think you seem to get that somewhat more in popular culture, in film occasionally, but I can easily imagine a thing like that happening in art too. You could certainly see it in advertising. These absolutely ridiculous scenes of revolutionary movements getting well, for example, that famous Pepsi ad, right? I mean, that do you remember the infamous Pepsi ad? Do you remember the Pepsi ad? Yeah, I mean, where you take up Black Lives Matter and turn it into a way of selling Pepsis and so forth. But beyond that, I mean, one of the things that to me is fascinating about five-car stud, the Keane Holtz, I should have kept on saying his name, five-car stud, and keep in mind what he's doing there. He's making a bet. It's a wager. He's all in on he may not have the cards for it. That's what, and he calls it that because he's aware of that. And it was so completely harrowing when you went in there. It's right on the knife edge. It could be merely, and if it was done to make money or to be, and so forth, it could have been that. Or let me rephrase that. It could have raised those issues. There's nothing wrong with raising the issues as long as you then talk about it. I think, and by the way, and he was far from being an easygoing liberal. He was a libertarian. He was a character. I mean, one of his dealers once said to me, I was doing a book about him some years ago, and one of his dealers said to me, "A quarter turn of the screw, a quarter turn, and we could have had Adolf Hitler all over again." I mean, he was a real rural libertarian, but he had a kind of common sense that this wasn't right, what was happening to blacks, for example. But he's skating right on the edge, I think, and if somebody wanted to make a case that it is outrageous and they didn't want that being shown, it would be something worth talking about.
We've also had the flip side, not at the same level of, not about horror, but the attack on black artists when they don't depict black people sufficiently, right? And if you remember the bust of Martin Luther King, so Ren and I were there for the celebration of the very, very first celebration of the national holiday that was Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. And it was the unveiling of this bust that was actually commissioned and produced by a black artist, an amazing sculptor. And he was vilified, actually, by a lot of black leaders because the bust, if you've ever, have anyone in this room seen the bust in Washington, in the Capitol? No? Okay, so he's looking down and he's looking human. It's not a bust. It's right. It's not this exultory, kind of, yeah. It is a very, very human portrait of someone who is a man, not someone who was a kind of a made larger than life. And as a result, there were people who hated it because it didn't put him on a high enough pedestal. So there's a sort of flip side there as well, where the challenge also comes from the other direction.
And then this is not even to mention the whole Confederate, statues thing. By the way, just a fact that you may like to know, all those horsemen, the generals on horseback. First of all, you probably do know this. Those were not statues of Confederate generals that were put up in 1865. They are never put up they don't begin showing up for about 30 years, and the people who want to put them up are Ku Klux Klan people, and it has to do with the politics of that moment. They are forcing back down the incipient free blacks who are now 21, 25, 30 years old and are just too uppity, and they're being forced out, and now suddenly you have the movement of the fantasy of the lost cause and so forth. So you have them, and then in response, generals start showing up in Boston and so forth, Union generals. But the point is, you can do a chart of if there's beginning to be a black uprising, you get a whole bunch more of these things. But here's my favorite fact: all of the horse statues came from the same factory. And they were reprovided for everybody, and they just put different faces on them. That they were kind of, it's kind of like things when you order clothes right now on the internet, you can get a certain size and a color and so forth and so on. They had, okay, so what do you want? You want him slim, fat? Is he got his hand up? A sword, a musket, and it was all and the reason they all look alike is they are all alike, but the northern ones are the same as the southern ones. That would be a problem, by the way, in the list of
It's also true with the Confederate flag coming up as actually a response to school desegregation in Brown v. Board. Yes, a question.
Is it on? Yeah, cool. Thanks for the lecture. It was very insightful. As always, I also thank you to the organization once again. I think you're not thanked enough. Anyway, I was thinking, following the Vegas mass shooting, the debate on the NRA and gun ownership has opened up again, and it's terrible that such an event has to happen before the debate starts to open up again publicly. But I'm wondering how we've gone from, as you were saying, the Second Amendment was at first about a well-regulated militia. How have we gone from that to individual right to bear firearms?
The word is Scalia. No, it's absolutely fascinating. It wasn't until certainly my lifetime. I forget maybe there's a lawyer here, but the Supreme, there was not a right to bear arms seen by individuals, seen in the Constitution until there was a 5-4 vote. It happens after Reagan has come to power. You begin to get these Federalist judges and so forth, Federalists who then, and by the way, it's a fantastic example. They are originalists, as they say. It's not that they're racist, it's just they believe we should just do whatever it says in the Constitution. The fact that it's a Constitution written by slaveholders and bankers, but they are found, and we're not allowed to do anything else. And what they then find in it, supposedly on originalist ground, really fascinating. There is no individual right to bear arms, but they find one there. They're going to find one no matter what, and then they claim the reason they have it is because it's there. But it was very, very recently that was found to be the case, at a time when there are much fewer guns in America, at a time when the NRA was a hunting persons association. There was a time when the NRA was not a wing of the Republican Party and so forth. There was a time when it was all kinds of hunters. And by the way, there's no reason why it couldn't be taken over by regular people again. I mean, it's currently taken. It is a gun manufacturers lobby and so forth. An amazing statistic I heard the other night is that we are almost at the point now where there's one gun for every person in America, which is something like more than that, over 350 million. But only 30% of Americans have guns, and of that 30%, it's something like 1% that have the vast majority of the guns.
Other questions, comments? Yes, thank you.
Hello. Thank you for the lecture and introducing me to 5-car stud. I didn't know that existed, and it was definitely uncomfortable for me to see that act of violence. But from what I gather, I think in the art world, it's like there's that debate of what's okay to show and what's not. And especially, I think within the Black community, we kind of point the finger and, say, you can do this, but you can't do that. But that Emmett Till painting, I think, belongs up there. And people need to see just how his mother said, like, open the casket. There's this kind of, like, I don't quite understand what the tension is, why there's trouble in, like, choosing what to represent. What's wrong with ruffling feathers, especially in regards to race?
Yeah, well, so I think I actually think there is a reason for it that we should name. And the Whitney actually does have a show, or actually I guess it closed, a show where they actually pulled out from their archives the organizing that happened because Blacks had not been adequately given opportunities to show their work. So I think it's the way in which wedges get created because we exclude. Brent's going to disagree with that. But that doesn't mean it wouldn't happen anyway, but I think we also can't ignore the flip side of the problem, which is that who has been given the privilege to be artists has been a privilege because it has required money, materials are expensive, the education can be expensive, and then the entry into the art world particularly into museum shows and gallery shows, has been highly racialized. And I think it is, I actually agree with Ren's thesis, so it's not a disagreement with the thesis, but it is to say that there are all kinds of structural impediments to the full and fair ability of people of color in this country to also have a voice in the art. That doesn't mean we should take it away from having the witnesses, that we all should be witnesses. And I think that's a critically important point. And what is important about some of what was in the shows, there were a lot of white artist allies who actually, in some instances, said they would not show their art when black artists were organizing protests about the fact that black artists were not being represented in shows. And that's also important to recognize.
I just think in terms of that particular biennial, they had gone to considerable length. Yeah. They, and in terms of the discomfort you felt, I mean, I don't need to tell you, this is not old history. Specifically, this is something that will blow some of your minds. Any of you remember Outlaw Josie Wales? Okay, it's a good film, but it's a fine film. And it was written by a guy who was a speechwriter for George Wallace, who earlier in his career had been one of the people involved in the castration, where in 1956, what town was it in? I'm trying to remember. It was 1954. A 34-year-old African-American from Marlborough County was castrated by Carter's men. Anyway, and that is the same guy who then reinvents himself as a speechwriter for George Wallace, and then reinvents himself once again as an author of great screenplays and novels about the West. No, it did. I agree. Yeah, that happened about.
Hi, thank you again for an amazing presentation. I have like a thought, but I'm not sure if it's quite a question yet, but I'm just thinking back to what you said about this suffering as spectacle happening a lot in pop culture, and that kind of being a space where we see it often. And I'm thinking also about the Dana Schutz piece, and thinking about the art world as this very privileged space that many people are unable to enter into, and how important like a piece like the Emmett Till one is to ruffle feathers and to have people thinking a little bit and feeling a little discomfort. And I'm just thinking about that kind of ruffling of feathers happening in pop culture, and like how you see us that like being able to exist and like actually remain not as spectacle. And it's disheartening to think that art always has to exist in this space that's just for the privileged few, and others around it have to be subjected to Pepsi ads as their way of So
We're going to have a whole series next year, in the spring next year. Right, start about artists who are engaged in social work and social practice. Just right now, for example, there's a new film that just came out that's played somewhere about the artist J.R. Agnes Varda, who was the first of the French New Wave back in 1953. So she's like this grandmother, has just hung out with this guy J.R., and there's a film about what they do, but he's the guy who makes those huge photographs that he then puts on the walls of favelas, or there's recently been this little baby like almost holding the wall on the southern border and so forth. Very revolutionary work, but there's all kinds of artists who are trying to do that, and there's, by the way, a wonderful tradition of black art. In LA, actually, there were David Hammonds and people like that who were doing terrific art. But indeed, I mean, I agree with you that the challenge is that. By the way, one of the real problems nowadays is the debt, the student debt that art students have. There was a terrific piece at the biennial that was just about, it was all these different artists who are trying to get started, talking about what it's like to try to get started as an artist when you have $50,000, $75,000 debt. And it was remember that piece? It was a really good piece. But and I guess, by the way, a quick answer to the question of what the opposite of being a spectator is it's being a citizen. And everything in America conspires to turn us from citizens into spectators. And the revolutionary move for people today is to refuse those seductions.
I was actually, oh, I'm sorry, we had another person over here and then Kay. Yes. Sorry. Yes, and then no, we had someone right there. Yeah. Yes. Raise your hand again. So, yeah.
Also, thank you very much for the lecture. I wanted to go back to something we talked about, language. Is it on? Okay, sorry. I wanted to go back to what you said about language, the use of language. And you mentioned, I think this is after you spoke about Elliot Weinberger, the poet, and then you talked about the use of the left using a particular language and the right, this was during the Reagan years, using a particular language. And you mentioned the Communist Manifesto, you mentioned Brecht, that they used simple language, and that now, if I understood correctly, the left is using much more complex such words, which I've heard a lot in these lectures, is this intersectionality, right? So I'm wondering, what is your position on the type of language that should be used that has a certain influence?
And I indeed am making a criticism of, I mean, I was very, very lucky. I graduated in I dodged a bullet. I graduated got a bachelor's degree in 1974. I was about to do 5 years of graduate school. I had a full fellowship at the University of Toronto. Had I done that, because that wave arrives in 1975 in America, the wave of French theory and criticism, and then there's a lot of French theory that I don't mind, but what it's done to American academic life is catastrophic, as far as I can tell. And it is incredibly Mandarin. It is extreme, with major exceptions who are quite wonderful, but the vast majority of it is extremely stylized. It's many syllables, and it doesn't. It speaks relentlessly about poor people and so forth, but doesn't speak to poor people. And what you have that is the kind of thing that Hannah Black represents, I think, people who've been educated that way. I absolutely, and as a writer, my whole thing is to write in ordinary English. The people, by the way, the people who are listed in that quote, it's Brecht, it's Tom Paine. If you haven't read Tom Paine, you owe it to yourself to read Tom Paine. If you have not read the Communist Manifesto, by the way, just pick it up. You'll be in the library one day. Just go. I mean, it's incredibly bracing. In fact, one of the things that's so amazing about the Communist Manifesto, it's in awe of capitalism. The way he's describing what capitalism, I mean, it's this incredible power and so forth. You know, it's almost like you see him just almost a quarter turn on the screw and he would have been in love with it. But then he realizes that it's horrible what it's doing, and then he's coming out the other side. But another person in that list was Hikmet, Nazim Hikmet, Hikmet, a Turkish poet. And if you've never read his poetry, you're about to encounter one of your favorite poets. He's just incredible. Things I Didn't Know I Loved, and other poems. He was in prison as a communist in Turkey after 1945 for like 15 years. Anyway, he just bracing ordinary language. And by the way, if you take the example of Brecht, it's not that his ideas are simple, I think it's Bukowski who says that a intellectual expresses a simple idea in difficult language. An artist expresses a difficult idea in simple language, I think, and that's a nice way of putting it. Let me just also just give a quote from Baldwin again, since we're always using them. It seems to me that the artist's struggle for his integrity is a kind of metaphor, must be considered as a metaphor for the struggle which is universal and daily of all human beings on the face of this terrifying globe to get to become human beings.